Okay. Hello, my name is Heather Pitre. I'm a senior psychology major, and I would first like to thank all of you for coming here today. I greatly appreciate it. This is In the Eye of the Storm, Psychological Barriers to Mandatory Evacuation Orders, and I completed my research under the advisorship of Dr. Katie Rackley. So this is just a quick overview of what I'll be discussing today. I have my introduction, my hypotheses, my methods section, results section, discussion section, and then lastly, my conclusion. So for my introduction, I wanted to study the reason as to why people ignore mandatory evacuation orders for hurricanes and risk their lives by staying home through a storm. So for the purpose of my research, before conducting my survey, I wanted to do some preliminary research just to see how hurricane evacuation orders are perceived by people. And so what I found is that short fuse evacuation notices aren't always avoidable, especially with rapidly forming storms, but evacuation compliance is markedly lower when a day or less notice is given. I also found that the feeling that storms come through all the time, people are always getting warnings and nothing ever happens, so they feel that they're told to evacuate, but it might not have been a life-threatening situation where they didn't necessarily need to evacuate. And then the last bit of information I found is that understanding the influence of cultural beliefs has the potential to help forecasters, media, and public officials improve communication of hazardous weather information. For my background and importance, southern states, especially states like Texas, Louisiana, and Florida, are some of the most prone states to be hit by hurricanes, and that's just because of their location and the location of the Gulf of Mexico having easy access to them. And being someone who was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, I'm no stranger to hurricanes. I've lived through my fair share. There's also a very big growing danger of hurricanes, and this is because of climate change, and it's made hurricanes in recent years become bigger and stronger and more impactful. And we've seen this especially recently, especially with the storms in Florida. And then also, people perceive mandatory evacuation orders in different ways. So for some reason or another, people may choose to ignore the mandatory evacuation order, which can sometimes unfortunately lead to somebody losing their life in the storm. As for my study objectives, I wanted to see what factor was kind of the strongest in holding people back from evacuating. So I'm going to be looking at money and whether or not people have enough funds to afford to evacuate. I'm also going to be looking at people's relationship with other people and whether or not people that you know are evacuating. And then I'll also be looking at objects and your attachment to your objects and whether or not you can bring your possessions with you when you evacuate or if you have to leave them behind. Now onto my hypothesis. So I have two hypotheses. My first is that when people face any type of barrier, they will be less likely to evacuate for a hurricane. And my second hypothesis is when barriers are resolved, people will be more likely to evacuate than if they do not perceive facing any barriers to begin with. For my methodology, my procedure was a self-report repeated measures through an online software called Qualtrics, and it was open to anyone in the St. Edward's community who would like to participate in it. My motive variables, I studied people's likelihood to follow mandatory evacuation orders when different barriers were presented to them, and then also when those barriers were resolved and removed. As for the type of questions that I asked, I started with some basic demographic questions, and then I had some free response questions about your previous experience with hurricanes, and then I had some vignettes about a hurricane and a Likert scale question asking someone's likelihood to evacuate in the given situation. As for my open-ended questions, I had 4. My first was, have you ever been in the storm path of an incoming hurricane? Then I asked, how many hurricanes have you experienced? Next, I asked, have you ever chosen to evacuate because of a hurricane? And then my 4th open-ended question was, why did you make this decision to either evacuate or to not evacuate? And what factors were important in this decision-making process? As for my vignette questions, I created a hypothetical situation of a realistic hurricane that was approaching and the government calling for a mandatory evacuation. I then asked the study participants to rate how likely they are to evacuate in the given situation. This situation had no barrier in it, so from now on I'll be referring to this situation as the no barrier situation. I then repeated the same hypothetical situation, but I added a sentence at the end that had a barrier of some sort. I did this 6 different times, so I had 6 different barriers that I studied. The 6 barriers were not having enough money to afford to evacuate, having previously evacuated for another hurricane when you didn't need to evacuate, your home is filled with family heirlooms that hold a lot of sentimental value to you, having just built a new home in the city that you grew up in and love, having none of your family, friends, or neighbors evacuating with you, and then the last barrier was that your home holds a lot of monetary value in the expensive possessions that you have. And then I repeated these same vignettes, but I switched the barriers to a resolved barrier. So then, as for my participant information, I got 54 participants to take my survey. The ages ranged from 18 years old to 63 years old, with the average age being 27 years old. I had 15.8% of my participants were freshmen in college, 5.3% of my participants were sophomores in college, 17.5% were juniors, 26.3% were seniors, 1.8% were fifth-year seniors, and 33.3% classified as other, so that could be anything as having already graduated or just not currently being in school. And as for the race of my participants, 49% of my participants identified as white or Caucasian, 38.6% of my participants identified as Hispanic or of Spanish origin, 7% of my participants identified as Black or African American, 3.5% of my participants identified as biracial or multiracial, and 1.8% of my participants identified as Asian or Asian American. Now on to the results. I analyzed my data from my survey with 2 different sets of dependent t-tests. For the first set, I compared the baseline variable, which was the generic no barrier situation, to each of the 6 situations that presented a barrier. So I compared the baseline to not having enough money to evacuate, having previously evacuated for no reason, having your home filled with family heirlooms, having just built a new home, none of your neighbors or family are evacuating, and then having your home filled with expensive possessions. So in my results, you can see the mean shows someone's likelihood to evacuate, with 10 being the most likely to evacuate, 0 being not likely at all to evacuate. So when there's no barrier compared to no money, you can see that when you do not have enough money to evacuate, you are less likely to evacuate. And if you see the p-value, it is less than 0.05, meaning that my data is significant, and there is very little possibility that I got this data by some sort of mistake. You can also see that when there's no barrier versus having previously had a false evacuation, you're less likely to evacuate. The same for no barrier and having family heirlooms in your house, you're less likely to evacuate. Having just built a new home, you are also less likely to evacuate. None of your family, friends, or neighbors are evacuating, less likely to evacuate. Having your home filled with expensive possessions, you are also less likely to evacuate. And all of that data was significant. Now for the second set of dependent t-tests, I compared the barrier variable to then when the barrier is resolved. So I compared not having enough money to now you do have enough money to evacuate. You previously evacuated for no reason to now in the past you wish you would have evacuated when you didn't. Your home is filled with family heirlooms to now all of your heirlooms are safely stored away in a waterproof safe. You just built a new home to now your home is elevated to help avoid water damage. None of your family or neighbors are evacuating to now everyone you know is also evacuating. And then your home is filled with expensive possessions to now all of your expensive possessions are also stored in a waterproof safe. So you can see from the mean that now you do have enough money, you are much more likely to evacuate than when you didn't have enough money, and the p-value shows the significance. I would also like to preface that the t-values are negative in these results because of the direction of the effect is different, and you get this when the different score is calculated from the first score minus the second score. As for when you previously wished you would have evacuated, now you're more likely to evacuate. Having your family heirloom stored away in a waterproof safe also shows more likely to evacuate. Having a new home and now your home is elevated to avoid water damage, you're more likely to evacuate. And I would like to point out this p-value is right at the 0.05, which this is still significant data, but I think that the reasoning for it being on the cusp of significant or not significant is because although your home is elevated to avoid water damage, with hurricanes, water can rise, and so you could still be trapped in your home. So maybe that's why some people weren't as likely to evacuate. When no one you know is evacuating versus everyone you know is evacuating, you are more likely to evacuate. And then you are also more likely to evacuate when all of your personal possessions are stored away safely in a waterproof safe. Now on to my discussion. So I found that adding a barrier to the hurricane situation decreases the likelihood of someone following the mandatory evacuation order. Each barrier that was studied decreases someone's likelihood to evacuate. And then when people's barriers are resolved, their likelihood of evacuation then increases. And both of my hypotheses were supported. As for my study limitations and future directions, one of my limitations is that I had a small sample size, so in the future I would like to recruit more and get some more diverse participants to take my survey. Another limitation is that I did provide a hypothetical situation, so people had to imagine what they would do and how they would react if a hurricane was approaching. So in the future, I would like to compare people who have hurricane experience to people who don't have any hurricane experience and see how their data differs and if having to imagine this hypothetical situation has any effect on the data. I would also like to analyze the open-ended responses that I got in the beginning. And then I would also like to continue proposing plans to help get people evacuated if they do not already have a plan to get themselves evacuated. And now for my conclusion. There are different reasons that people have when they do not follow evacuation orders. No person is the same. Addressing barriers will help people be able to leave, and some factors will always have bigger impacts on people's decision to either leave or to stay, such as family and money being the biggest factors. And I would like to acknowledge Dr. Katie Rackley for helping, supporting, and guiding me these past 2 semesters when working on my research. And I would also like to acknowledge the St. Edward's University Honors Program for giving me this opportunity to complete this research and to present it here today. And these are my references from this presentation. And thank you. Any questions? Justin?
I have a question. So for hurricane-prone states, do you feel like they would be more likely to evacuate or less likely to evacuate?
I think that's a really great question because I could see it going either way with people living in hurricane-prone states, knowing about the dangers of hurricanes, and then wanting to get out and evacuate. But I think that people who do live in hurricane-prone states might be less likely to evacuate because they would feel more experienced with hurricanes and feel a sense of being stronger and being able to fight the storm.
Following up on that, so do you feel like for those who, like, depending on the severity of a hurricane, change their opinions on evacuation measures?
I think so. I think if you've experienced some more severe hurricanes in your past, such as a Category 4 or a Category 5, and you get a warning about another one coming, you'd be more likely to evacuate versus if you've never experienced one and know the severity of it. You might be a little bit more hesitant. Yes?
Based on your experience growing up in Louisiana, were you surprised at all by these findings, or were they what you expected, or?
I would say that I was a little bit surprised of how concise everyone was in their results of wanting to evacuate, because back home in New Orleans, some people will not leave for storms, and that was a really big issue with like Hurricane Katrina. Yes?
So 2 of the main factors contributing to staying during hurricanes was family and money. I don't know if there's like public transportation to get you out for an evacuation, but if public transportation was offered for free, that would
I think having public transportation for free to get you out would help get people evacuated, and that's something that you see in a lot of hurricane-prone states and cities, is that now they have what's called evacu spots. So if there is a mandatory evacuation order given out, you can go to one of those evacu spots and a bus will shuttle you out of the city for free. Yes?
When we were talking about your results, the one that you mentioned before, that the p-value is 0.05 with the house being on stilts, you mentioned an interesting pattern with the results where people might go either way with the stilts in terms of whether they would leave or whether they wouldn't. And I wanted to give you opportunity to talk about that a little bit more, because I thought that was really interesting since you had that lived experience.
Yeah, I feel that in a lot of hurricane-prone states, people will have their houses elevated so that they can then stay for the storm, but the water can always rise higher, such as if a levee breaks or if a canal breaches, the water just comes rushing in, and even though your home is elevated, you still won't have a way to get out, and the water could still get inside of your home.
Probably have time for one more question or comment. Anyone else? All right, fantastic. Directly up to say a few words to Cord and Stoll Heather. So I met Heather a year and a half ago when she was in my psychology of Harry Potter class, which is a real class, it's a lot of fun. But she was one of the strongest students in that class, and so it made it a very easy yes when you asked me to supervise her thesis. And as a fellow Hufflepuff, I can say that in my experience, you embody that spirit. You always bring in a very sunny and caring disposition. You were very hardworking, very dependable. It was always a joy when we got to meet, one of the highlights of my day. And also very clearly you have a passion for justice and for helping people. That's clear in all of the stuff that you do. You want to help people to improve their quality of life. Given your topic here, your work as a residence assistant, I know that's very important to you. So I am so proud of you. It's been such a journey to get to see you grow as a scholar, as a researcher, as a fellow Hufflepuff. Congratulations. You're one big step closer to graduation. I'm so proud of you. We'll do this one first. Do you want it forward or back?
It can sit back.
It's an important question.